Welcome. This is Sabrina Monarch bringing you the astrology forecast for June 24 to June 30th. And it's a pretty dynamic week. We have Venus stationing direct in Gemini, Mars changing signs to enter Aries, and the second of 3 exact hits of Jupiter and Pluto conjunct in Capricorn, which is a transit that is really characterizing 2020. So before we get started, I just want to ask and remind you to please like this video and leave a comment about what your takeaways are, what resonates with you, any insights that you get from the forecast. And let's get into it. I'm going to pull up my slides. So this week, Venus stations direct, Mars changes signs and enters Aries, and the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn forms its second of 3 exact alignments. To hold this week in the context of Cancer season and Mercury retrograde also in Cancer, I am brought again and again to meditations on emotional range and bandwidth, how internally we can be so deeply at home with ourselves that we are capable to meet challenges in our life with a spirit of curiosity and willingness to change, rather than fear and avoidance. Range also means that we are capable of fluidly experiencing a variety of emotional states, rather than just feeling locked into a few, some of our default comfortable emotions. This correlates with not having fear around going into the depths, as well as not having guilt about feeling joy. I think that both of these kind of scenarios on either side of the spectrum are the consequence of not having emotional range. Life isn't simple, life is very complex. And so we can also have a complex range of emotions, and that's okay, right? So Venus stationing direct signals not the end of Venus retrograde season, almost, but the beginning of the end. Venus will leave post-retrograde shadow. So this is the degree that Venus originally stationed retrograde in. This will happen on July 28. So this is a wrap-up. How has your heart opened in the last few months? I think that Venus retrogrades are very magical transits. They actually, astronomically, Venus and the Sun form a 5-pointed star. And each point of the star is occurring during a Venus retrograde. You can look it up on Google, search like Venus 5-pointed star orbital pattern, and you'll find what I'm talking about. So in Gemini, some things to consider. Have you learned new communication skills or revised the way that you talk to yourself? And we're going to get more into this. So our week in some more detail after a few announcements. I forgot to mention as well that these forecasts are also in written version at monarchastrology.com. And if you like any of the images that you see in this presentation, you can go to monarchastrology.com and see the image credits there. And also read the written versions of the forecast there. So some announcements. I have a Kickstarter campaign to fund the year ahead of forecasts and podcast episodes, Magic of the Spheres podcast. This June marked the beginning of the 6th year of weekly content creation. And I'm offering a bunch of rewards for people that help me fund the year ahead, from astrology downloadables, astrology readings, tuition to my evolutionary astrology intensive, and the lowest ever tuition to a new course called Online Presence as Performance Art. So the reality is that there is no kind of publishing company or magazine that pays me to create this content. I just create it. And if you enjoy it and you want to support its existence, then it's up to you, the audience. So I'm asking for support for the year ahead, and I'm hoping to get 200 backers. At the time of recording this, we're at 20 backers, and we just launched a few days ago. So I'm really overjoyed at the results that have come so far. So the campaign's going to last until July 30th, and I'm going to leave the link to the campaign in the notes. And I promise there's a bunch of really interesting and life-changing opportunities that can come through the Kickstarter. And speaking of one of them, I'm teaching a course called Online Presence as Performance Art. And this is a class to re-enchant the internet. For anyone who has a message that they want to share, or a spiritual business, or a business that's even not necessarily spiritual, but you are spiritual, I'm sharing some insights about how to interact with the internet in a more magical way and really move away from the story that the internet is a place of soul-sucking scrolling and that it's a place of magic and connection instead. I'm probably going to be saying that soul-sucking scrolling multiple times. It's funny now to think of it, but this is kind of what people have in their minds as what the internet is about, when it really can be a more magical experience. So this is going to be a course to help you with the psychological and inner emotional processes of taking up space on the internet and being a public figure, because the public presentation is one thing, the finished product is one thing, but everyone who puts themselves out there in the public has an internal process as well. And I want to share a lot of insight with you about what that is, because honestly, everyone has hangups about it. It's scary to put yourself out there. And if we have some mental and emotional frameworks to work through that, then we can go ahead and share our magic with the world and meet unknown friends and colleagues and clients in the process. The next run of my Evolutionary Astrology Intensive is also posted, the dates, and I'm going to leave the link to both courses that I'm mentioning in the notes, and they're both available at discounts through the Kickstarter right now. And last announcement before we begin, there's a new podcast episode. This is part 2 of a conversation that I had with Bear River about reincarnation. The last episode, part 1, we focused on reincarnation through the lens of Venus and Mars. And in this episode, we ventured out to the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. So go ahead and tune into that where you listen to podcasts. And here's our week. On June 24th, Venus will station direct in 5 degrees of Gemini at 11:48 p.m. Pacific. So consider the journey of the heart that you've been on since April 9, 2020, when Venus first entered pre-retrograde shadow. Venus stationed retrograde on May 12th and will leave post-retrograde shadow on July 28. So you may feel a certain shift now with Venus stationing direct. Certainly planets that are stationing are louder and more noticeable energies in the sky and in our experience. And you can expect the themes of this transit to permeate through July, because we're not really over with the Venus retrograde season, but this is a pivotal kind of wrap-up turning point. One lesson that we've been learning, and it's not too late if you don't feel you've learned this yet, is the value of changing our thoughts or choosing thoughts on purpose. Related to Venusian themes, it may be our inner scripts around self-worth, attractiveness, magnetism, wealth, and so on. An elevated principle of Venus is that we can have what our heart desires if we believe we're worthy of it. Yet, we often have many magical structures set in place in our minds that dictate why we can't have what we desire, whether that is an assessment of our own limitations or our conceptualizations of what other people think of us, and these can be our imagination too, what we anticipate other people will think of us, or an assessment of these circumstances that hinder us. We may also have thought forms that are based in trauma. I mean, we often do. Or what we desire is something that we've never had before, and therefore it's truly hard to imagine it being possible. So things that you've already accomplished in your life, it's kind of easier to imagine like, yeah, sure, I can do that again. But if it's something that is your cutting edge, there can be more mental resistance towards having or achieving. As an act of self-love, consider doing the following practice and repeat as often as you like. This is something that has really come into my field and been something that I've been working with during this Venus retrograde, which really made sense for Venus being in Gemini. But I think I'm going to be carrying it with me throughout, and I hope that you find it helpful as well. So call to mind what you truly desire and write it down. I mean, first of all, it's important to know what you desire and to generate desires. being in relationship with our desires is also this process of feeling okay having desires, because there's also a sense of turmoil that we can feel when we desire something and we don't feel we can have it. So we just would rather not have the desire at all. So this is kind of like getting yourself simmering if you let yourself feel into what you want. So write down what you desire, and next write down all your resistant thought forms. These are thoughts about yourself, about your worthiness, about your readiness, these kinds of things, as well as things like how other people judge you or circumstances that block you. Let's say this was romantic love, for example. You can have your own stories about why you can't have it, like what's wrong with you kind of thing. But you can also have stories about other people, like generalized statements about they're never trustworthy. And so this is a pattern that you are in interaction with. Then next, source compassion and acceptance for yourself for having these thoughts. This is important. So this is also a big thing in general when it comes to working with emotions and thought forms of any kind, that we can be like sad and then be upset that we're sad. And then there's this meta level of judgment for having a thought or having an emotion. So working with just accepting things as they are and not feeling like it's bad. You can feel anything, think anything, and just accept it. And this, I mean, yeah, it's a little bit of a process to figure out how you can accept things. So I invite you to tune into what that is for you that helps you do that. Lastly, rewrite these thoughts, these negative and resistant thoughts, into something more generous that you can truly get behind. So don't just lie to yourself, but come up with something that you can get behind. And wear those thoughts throughout the day, circulating them through your nervous system like a spell. And I do believe that our thought forms create an aura around us, and we can choose thoughts and kind of circulate them around us and magically shift our reality. Gemini is related to the magician after all. You may find it's not always enough to just reverse a negative thought. It's not always convincing enough. These new thought forms must be clever. Some idea that brings a spark into your consciousness. Sometimes it's a new angle that is persuasive enough to do this for you. So tender topic here. And related to Venusian things, because Venus relates to beauty and relates to self-worth, and also how we relate to others based on our sense of self-worth. So let's say that you have a facial or body feature that you are perpetually insecure about, and it has triggered a logical structure in your consciousness that you won't be loved by another person because of it. So sure, if we want to have a particular change of appearance, or we're judging a part of our appearance, we could say it's just for the aesthetic delight, like I just want to look a certain way. But it is also often attached to a desire to be received in a certain way, or to be the recipient of another person's attraction, or to be loved, right? And trying to negotiate a thought like, I actually love my insert feature here, may not be immediately easy for you to get behind or to believe. Then you may need a thought like, and listen, bear with me. My significant other is enchanted by my entire essence. Every detail about me only adds to how enamored they are with me. See how that feels a lot different? And that kind of thought doesn't mean that you actually have to look any different way. It's just you are okay the way you are, and you will be loved for it. And over time, you may also soften how you feel about said insecurity, because it's no longer logically attached to why you can't have what you desire. And you'll likely also transform how you feel about your worthiness. for anyone who's listening to this and doesn't see the images, if you're listening to the podcast version, this image is Rogelio from Jane the Virgin, a GIF, him saying, "People fall in love with me all the time, Xiomara." So sometimes appearance and beauty are relegated to the category of vanity and superficiality. But in Venusian reality, these things burn with a hot passion inside of us. Many of us, at least. And because it is worth saying, beauty can be decolonized. Beauty does not just have to belong to ideal features that have been marketed to us at a hypnotic onslaught in this reality. We do not have to be conventionally any certain way to embody and exude Venus. Inner Venusian work is about getting into harmonic relationship with our own desires and passions and our worthiness to receive, and moving out of states of lack or disempowerment around abundance. So abundance of self-value, pleasure, money, etc. And because we're talking about Venus and Gemini, this can be, do we have a lack of thoughts that are self-valuing, and can we generate some and create this abundant spell in our nervous system and in our field? And you'll notice that if you really play with your thoughts and really work with this, that you can actually change how you feel and change how you walk, change how you hold yourself, and change what happens in your reality. And all too often, we hold thoughts and logical structures very close as though they are describing our reality, when they are also working to perpetuate and recreate the same reality over and over again. The word is magic. And the more conscientious we can be about how we participate with word magic, the more intentional our creativity becomes. So Venus and Gemini wrap up lessons. I encourage you to experiment with this as time goes on. On June 27, Mars enters Aries at 6:45 p.m. Pacific. And we have a long time of Mars and Aries ahead, since Mars will retrograde in this sign. Mars won't exit Aries until January 6, 2021. So for the rest of the year, we have Mars in Aries. And Mars will station retrograde on September 9th. So a little bit of time before that, but Mars in Aries. It's actually going to station retrograde towards the very end of the sign. So that's part of why it's in it for so long. But in general, Mars retrogrades do relate to Mars being in a sign for a good number of months. So Mars is in its home sign in Aries. And in a conversation around the astrological concept of essential dignity, and so as a modern astrologer, as an evolutionary astrologer myself, I haven't worked with essential dignity myself for most of my practice. But it's a conversation in the Hellenistic and traditional astrology communities, and I've been studying Hellenistic astrology, so I'm baby at it. So I'm incorporating some of the things that I'm learning into my astrological perceptions and teachings, and just barely with teaching, because I'm much more practiced in evolutionary astrology. But I wanted to include this concept as something to think about. Essential dignity is like the assessment of planets as exalted, in domicile, in detriment, in fall. So these are like assessments of the condition of the planet, how easily it expresses itself and its inherent nature, or when it's having to kind of borrow or be in another planet's house, so to say, and work with that planet's or that sign's tools instead of its own. And cello carpenter Pierce made a point that planets in domicile or exaltation are similar to privilege. And so Mars in Aries, it's Mars in domicile because Mars rules the sign of Aries. So it's like Mars is in its own home. And Cello writes, in another lens, when a planet is in a sign it rules or a sign of exaltation, there can be blind spots around the suffering of others. We might think of this as a form of privilege. And in defining and becoming aware of personal privileges, we become more responsible in the way we wield our privilege. So you can read Cello's entire post through a link that I'll be sharing in the notes. Essential dignity is this traditional astrology concept that you can learn more about by searching the hashtag DignityBabes on Instagram or Twitter. Or you can also listen to a conversation I had with Diana Rose Harper about essential dignity and the language we use in astrology, and I'll also leave that link in the notes. So considering Mars in Aries, empowered in its own home, here are a few thoughts. We are emerging from a season of Mars in Pisces, and Mars conjunct Neptune for a good part of this transit, where willpower and inspiration were some of our deepest energizers. So when we had faith, we had energy, and we probably directed our actions towards things that we felt really inspired and aligned about. Mars in Pisces is like spiritual warriorship. There could have also been struggles of faith or feelings of despair, and these would have had a direct impact on how much energy we would have felt and how energized we would feel to move towards our goals. This was a dynamic I was really playing with and noticing, and doing thought work, for example, just tracking how am I feeling, what am I thinking, how are my thoughts and feelings making me feel even further. So of course, it's not that much of a stretch that if we're feeling despair or feeling hopeless, that isn't the most galvanizing, vitality boosting feeling. Yet when we motivate ourselves to find a glimmer of hope or faith in moments where we don't have it, then it's like stoking a fire and we get energy again. So I think Mars in Pisces really highlighted that dynamic. Mars in Pisces was like, feel your inspiration, flood every cell, and then act. With Mars in Aries, it's a little more like, have an impulse and just do it. There may be more straightforwardness in the air as Mars enters Aries, as well as in our own individual processes. Regarding the concept of privilege, as I was speaking about, Aries can have a way of, getting its way. This can relate toward steamrolling, being heavy-handed, and being insensitive. In places where we have a lot of energy and power, we will want to be mindful of how we're using it. It's important to reflect upon and take notice of where we have power too. Aries can be very forceful and yet also has this psychology of being the underdog, of feeling like the underdog, which of course can translate to aggression. They're connected. So when we're aware of our power and strength, when we actually acknowledge it, then we can step into more noble uses of that power. Typically, the word impulsive has negative connotations, suggesting that a person is impetuous or hasty in a way that is flawed. Perhaps you may relate to the feeling state of being impulsive for lack of better judgment and then having to deal with the consequences afterward. However, Mars and Aries both put us in touch with the art of inhabiting our instincts and our instinctual natures, knowing how to act and when to act without having to miss the moment in fear or indecision. So what supports you in being in right relationship with your instincts? One thing that came to mind for me was thinking about embodiment. And if, for example, when it comes to the trauma response of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, and fawn is a more recent one that's been added, which is kind of where you attempt to kind of pander or be really gentle with someone who's being aggressive, for example. So either of these trauma responses, maybe you have one that you go to as your default, but by only having that limited range, it's like not having all the tools to play with your instincts with. So if you do anything that helps you get in touch with parts of yourself that are more latent or things that you personally push aside or have fear around embodying, then when certain situations come up, there can be more of like an ease of jumping into the necessary response. I find this with Mars, and we're about to talk about Saturn and a Mars-Saturn aspect, but a lot of what empowers Mars, I think, to have like a really healthy instinctual expression is some kind of training or conditioning that It's doing something over time and having practice that allows us to snap into action right when we need it. So it's not always in the moment that our instincts are something that we develop. It's the things that we do over time that help it. Those are just some of my thoughts, but think about it, like what helps you tune in with your instinct. So on June 28th, Mars in 0 degrees of Aries will sextile Saturn retrograde in 0 Aquarius at 3:58 a.m. Pacific. And these two slide past each other in harmonic aspect. The sextile is a harmonic aspect, as Saturn's retrograding soon to re-enter Capricorn. During the upcoming Mars retrograde, Mars will be making a more challenging aspect, the square, the 90-degree angle, which is far more confronting and kind of brings things to a head. And Mars and Saturn will be squaring each other for the majority of Mars retrograde. It's interesting then that the two should have this moment in passing, like this nod towards each other before wrestling later on. So some thoughts. Simply, when we have a goal or something we would like to bring into fruition, discipline, which is a Saturn principle, is needed. We need the discipline to show up consistently for the goal until we see it through. The discipline to be focused in our minds. This can even tie into what I was saying about Venus and Gemini things. Are you disciplined about your self-talk? And I don't mean in a way that you're suppressing and just stuffing down like, oh, negative thoughts or whatever, but actually working through them and having a process with them. If self-esteem is something that you want to cultivate on a regular basis, that is something that we can also be disciplined about. Any goal, there's discipline kind of worked into it in terms of what brings goals forward into fruition. So there's also the discipline to set aside time and honor the commitments that we make, and so on. And if we don't honor the Saturn principle in this way, Saturn can show up through other channels, like feeling inwardly frustrated that nothing is happening, we're not getting anywhere. It's hard either way. It's hard to do things and it's hard to not do things. It's hard to get the motivation to do something. And it's also hard to deal with the consequences of not doing the thing. I think in Saturn, like in that archetypal framework, there is that element of things being hard. So the question is not about ease, perhaps, as much as what we derive the most satisfaction from and the most self-esteem. So while it is true that some spiritual teachings and practices can resource us with the possibility of inviting more ease and flow into our life, like opening up to the idea that our lessons, our karmic lessons, can be learned with joy and grace instead of hardship, for example. Even so, believing the idea that nothing should be hard can be detrimental. Strength, Mars, is cultivated through resistance, Saturn, and there may be places in our lives where we desire a certain result or a certain kind of excellence. Saturn relates to excellence, and yet we don't want to work for it. See if you can tune into places in your life that moving forward into your resistance and doing the hard thing opens up a lot of opportunity, freedom, and joy for you. It's always a careful balance with Saturn of pushing our limitations to an extent so that we can grow, but also not driving ourselves into the ground and hurting ourselves with our discipline. And sometimes situations come up where it's just hard to tell. Anything that has been really difficult, for example, a conditioning or a training process, and you just want to quit and give up every day, but you know that if you keep trying and keep putting forth the energy that you're going to have a compound effect and something good is going to happen, and you haven't gotten there yet, so you don't know if that's coming for you. That is kind of those moments of why Saturn also relates to doubt. With Saturn in Aquarius, and it's going to go back into Capricorn, but I think that there's also a quality of being disciplined about being in our higher self state, for example, like cultivating enthusiasm and excitement and feeling lit up every day. And that's not just something that happens because our environment makes it happen for us. Things can be going great and we can still be unhappy. There's an internal discipline of choosing to stoke our fire and feel enthusiastic and feel excited. This can be done through gratitude practice or awe practice, focusing on things that bring you joy, doing things in your life that bring you joy, and cultivating a different vibrational field, a different conditioning in your life. And this is something you'd think that no one is necessarily disciplined about being happy, but I think a lot of people are disciplined about being happy, especially if they, like myself, I have a history of depression. So for me, happiness is a discipline. It's rewiring my brain. And also, the more that I do those things, the more that my life kind of expands and becomes more joyful. And it's not just something that runs itself, right? It's like a constant inner commitment towards what I value. So whatever it is for you, that internal commitment, I think Saturn in Aquarius is like the mindset side of it. So, okay, end this little mini rant. June 29, 2020, Jupiter retrograde in 24 degrees of Capricorn will be conjunct Pluto retrograde in 24 degrees of Capricorn at 10:47 p.m. Pacific. And this is one of the transits that characterizes 2020, and it's our second of 3 alignments. This transit is very clearly playing out through the conversation happening around racial injustice. And speaking here from the United States, though I know it's not limited to this country. So Jupiter is higher learning and expansion of consciousness, and Pluto is what is hidden and underneath, and processes of destruction and regeneration. Capricorn relates to history and structure and social conventions and social mores. So there's a transformational process happening around what is conventional and what is normal. Normally, we think of Jupiter as joyful expansion, or the quality of looking out toward the horizon and thinking that anything's possible. We think of travel and buoyant feelings of the world opening up. But this placement of Jupiter in Capricorn conjunct Pluto is not often fuzzy feeling. It's actually often more horrifying and disturbing. The realities of systemic racism and oppression are also only news to people that have had the privilege to opt out of paying attention to it. So this is all still an opportunity for expansion, speaking of Jupiter, should we collectively, and this is counting on every individual, so every individual has responsibility, so should we collectively gain greater bandwidth for confronting difficult realities, instead of continuing to sweep them under the rug because it's easier than to actually deal with it, then change can more readily occur. And so this process of things coming up and things being exposed is an expansion in a Jupiter and Capricorn style, conjunct Pluto. On an individual layer, this same dynamic of not moving forward without deconstructing systemic patterns applies. Often having a vision of where we are headed that is aspirational in any way, so envisioning a better life, includes the necessity of doing the work to deconstruct how and why things are the way that they are currently, so that unconscious patterns don't simply get projected into the future. In regards to the awakenings that we are currently experiencing, there's a long road ahead. For racial justice, as an example, this isn't a trend. Regardless of what happens in the headlines next week, next month, next year, deconstructing internalized racism, expanding our education, and personal recalibration are lifelong processes. On June 30th, Mercury retrograde in 9 degrees of Cancer will sextile Uranus in 9 degrees of Taurus. And this is at 3:13 p.m. Pacific. This is a good transit for epiphanies, and we may find the quality of our spontaneous thoughts shifting or elevating from pleasure and true nourishment. So as I was saying about having a discipline about being happy or being excited, that when we do the things that we know elevate us or put us in a better state, watch the quality and the content of your mind shifting. And I think that that's really helpful to have a meditation practice of some kind so that you can have a sense of what's happening in your mind by default. What kinds of thoughts are you thinking versus what do you think when you're like flooded with a sense of aliveness and happiness? It's interesting what ideas, what epiphanies, or what like ideas we have for things that we actually want to do in our lives come through when we're feeling really alive. And what it would mean to make decisions from that place more often than not. And later this day, the sun in 9 degrees of Cancer is conjunct Mercury retrograde in 9 degrees of Cancer at 7:52 p.m. Planets that are so close to the sun are difficult to see because the sun's light blinds them from our sight. With Mercury out of sight, it can mean that significant Mercury-related developments, so transmissions of messages and information, are occurring in a way that we cannot see yet until a little time passes and Mercury is no longer obscured by the sun. Alternately, there are messages that come through during Sun-Mercury conjunctions with piercing brightness, illumination, and awareness. As an experiment, you might see what it's like to go inward into meditation during this transit to see what's illuminated in your inner world, right? It's Mercury retrograde, so it's the internal Mercury, and the sun is kind of like that piercing light of awareness. So being in presence, being aware is a very kind of solar concept. And then still later this day, the sun in 9 degrees of Cancer will sextile Uranus in 9 degrees of Taurus at 11:07 p.m. And so basically what's happening is that the sun and Mercury are conjunct and they're both sextile Uranus and Taurus. So I have a quote from Bell Hooks from All About Love. And the quote goes, "In the Knitting Sutra, Susan Lydon, I don't know how to pronounce the name, Lydon, describes the labor of knitting as a freely chosen craft that enhances her awareness of the value of right livelihood. Sharing, what I found in this tiny domestic world of knitting is endless. It runs broader and deeper than anyone might imagine. It is infinite and seemingly inexhaustible in its capacity to inspire, excite, and provoke creative insight. Lydon sees the world that we traditionally have thought of as women's work as a place to discover godliness through the art of creating domestic bliss. A blissful household is one where love can flourish. Creating domestic bliss is especially useful for the individuals living alone who are just learning to be self-loving. When we intentionally strive to make our homes places where we are ready to give and receive love, every object we place there enhances our well-being." So that's Bell Hooks. The harmonic relationship between Taurus and Cancer hints at domestic bliss, with Cancer's quality of nesting and homemaking, and Taurus's attention to sensual pleasure and cultivating values and beauty. With the Sun and Uranus in these signs and harmonizing with each other, it speaks to the awakenings that can occur when we have cultivated an environment that reinforces our awakening. This is related both to how we interact with our physical environments as well as how we cultivate our mind. An awakening that we can experience through Uranus and Taurus is a radical sense of belonging to the earth. And as extensions of the earth, the body and one's environment. By tending to the creation of nourishment, pleasure, and home, inner and outer home, it's possible that we grow deeper roots that bring us into deeper embodiment and presence. So those are our transits for the week. Thank you for meditating on the planets with me this week. Again, please like this video, especially if you've made it this far, and subscribe, hit the notification bell so that you get notifications about new videos. And if you'd like further guidance, I do offer natal chart readings, individual chart readings. And I've also been increasingly focused on longer-term one-to-one mentorships, helping people form a depth relationship to their natal chart over time, and helping people move toward their goals and aspirations through the wisdom of the chart. And this is all about soul making too, and developing a deeper relationship with yourself through the beautiful language of astrology. So if you're interested in working together in that capacity, I'm currently accepting new clients. You can send me an email at sabrina@monarchastrology.com to start a conversation and set up a free consultation call with me. And find me on Instagram at Sabrina Monarch, on Twitter at Sabrina_Monarch. You can also find me on Facebook, Sabrina Monarch. And if you enjoyed this forecast, if you've been enjoying the forecasts and the podcast, go ahead and check out my Kickstarter linked below. I would love your support funding the year ahead. I hope you have a beautiful week. Let me know what resonated with you in the comments and how you're doing.